For 17 hours, Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had been missing in action. Her last known position, a collapsed watchtower in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The explosion that brought down the concrete structure had been visible from 3 miles away, a pillar of smoke and debris that marked what everyone assumed was the end of one of the Army's most skilled marksmen. Her radio had gone silent. Her GPS beacon had stopped transmitting. The drone footage showed nothing but rubble where the tower once stood.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The official casualty report was already being processed. Missing, presumed killed in action. Her personal effects would be packed, her family notified, her name added to the growing list of soldiers who hadn't made it home. But what no one knew, what couldn't have been predicted, was that in less than 6 hours, gunfire from an impossible position would save the lives of an entire Marine landing team. The morning had started like any other in Firebase Copper, a remote outpost carved into the rocky terrain of Kunar Province. Elena had taken her position in the watchtower before dawn, settling into the routine that had kept coalition forces alive for the past 8 months. Her Barrett M82 rifle was positioned to cover the northern approach, a valley that enemy fighters used to move supplies and personnel under cover of darkness. The tower itself was a testament to military engineering pragmatism. Thick concrete walls, narrow firing slits, and a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. It had weathered countless mortar attacks, small arms fire, and even a failed suicide bombing attempt. For Elena, it had become a second home, a place where she could disappear into the rhythm of observation and calculation that defined precision shooting. From her perch 40 feet above the firebase, she could see everything. The main gate where supply convoys arrived twice weekly, the helicopter landing pad where medevac flights came and went with grim regularity, the motor pool where mechanics worked to keep aging vehicles running in an environment that destroyed everything mechanical. Most importantly, she could see the approaches that enemy forces might use to attack the base. Elena Rodriguez was not a typical soldier by anyone's definition. At 28, she had already spent 6 years in the Army, with 2 previous deployments that had earned her a reputation among both peers and superiors, not for bravado or showmanship, but for a quiet competence that made dangerous situations feel manageable. Other soldiers joked that she could thread a needle at 800 meters, but the joke carried respect rather than mockery. Her background was unremarkable in the way that many military stories were. Small town in New Mexico, high school shooting team, college on an ROTC scholarship that led directly to active duty. What set her apart wasn't her origin story, but what she'd become through years of training and experience. The kind of shooter who could make impossible shots look routine, who understood wind and elevation and the dozens of other variables that determined where a bullet would impact. But more than technical skill, Elena possessed something rarer, the patience to wait. In a military culture that often rewarded aggressive action, she had learned the value of stillness. Hours spent motionless, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to engage. It was a mindset that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments and earned her the trust of commanders who knew that when Elena Rodriguez said she had a clean shot, the mission would succeed. The attack, when it came, followed a pattern that had become depressingly familiar. Coordinated mortar fire to pin down the defenders, followed by small arms fire from multiple directions to create confusion and divide the response. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves in the rocky outcroppings that surrounded the firebase, using natural cover to make themselves difficult targets while maintaining clear fields of fire into the base. Elena's role in these engagements was always the same: identify high-value targets and eliminate them with precision fire. enemy machine gun positions that could sweep the courtyard, mortar teams that posed the greatest threat to coalition forces, leaders whose removal would disrupt the attack's coordination. It was methodical work that required ice-cold calculation even as explosions shook the tower and rifle rounds cracked overhead. The Taliban fighters had learned to respect the tower over months of failed attacks. They knew that death waited behind those narrow firing slits, that showing themselves in the open during daylight hours meant joining the growing number of their comrades who had underestimated the American sniper. Some had taken to calling her the ghost in the mountain, a phantom who struck without warning and disappeared back into the shadows. What they hadn't expected was the rocket-propelled grenade that came from a position no one had been watching. The fighter had climbed higher into the mountains during the night, finding an angle that allowed him to target the tower's base. When the rocket struck, it didn't just damage the structure. It brought down 60 tons of reinforced concrete in a cascade of destruction that could be heard for miles. The explosion happened at 0847 hours, recorded by base cameras and witnessed by dozens of soldiers who had grown accustomed to seeing Elena in that tower every morning. One moment, the structure stood solid and imposing against the mountainside. The next, it was collapsing in on itself, throwing up a cloud of dust and debris that obscured the entire northern perimeter. Initial rescue attempts were driven back by continued enemy fire. The Taliban fighters, emboldened by their apparent success in eliminating the sniper, pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Without Elena's overwatch, they could move more freely, bringing their weapons closer to the base perimeter and increasing the pressure on the defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, the fire base commander, made the difficult decision that military leaders had been making for generations. With enemy fire still coming in and no signs of life from the collapsed tower, rescue efforts would have to wait until the tactical situation stabilized. Elena Rodriguez was officially listed as missing in action, her fate unknown but presumed fatal.
The attack continued for another 3 hours before the Taliban fighters melted back into the mountains, carrying their wounded and leaving behind the kind of battlefield debris that marked every engagement in this endless war. Spent shell casings, bloodstains on the rocks, and the lingering smell of cordite and smoke that would take days to fade completely. When rescue teams finally reached the collapsed tower, what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Tons of concrete had crushed everything inside, creating a tomb of rubble that would require heavy equipment to clear. Elena's rifle was recovered, its scope shattered and stock splintered by the impact. Her helmet was found 20 feet from the tower's base, cracked and blood-stained. But no body. The official explanation was straightforward. The violence of the collapse had likely buried her remains under tons of debris. Recovery operations would continue, but the priority was maintaining the firebase's defensive capabilities. The war didn't pause for individual tragedies, no matter how skilled or respected the fallen soldier might have been. What no one could explain was the single set of boot prints leading away from the wreckage, partially obscured by falling debris, but still visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The prints led north, toward the mountain passages that enemy fighters used to move between their camps and staging areas. They were the right size and tread pattern for standard army boots, but that seemed impossible given the destruction everyone had witnessed. The mystery deepened when base security cameras were reviewed. 47 minutes after the tower's collapse, movement was detected on a ridgeline 2 miles north of the firebase. The thermal signature was human-sized, but disappeared into the rocky terrain before a positive identification could be made. Given the ongoing tactical situation, the sighting was noted but not investigated. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had vanished into the mountains of Afghanistan, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that one of the Army's finest snipers was gone forever. Her personal effects were inventoried with military precision. Letters from home, photographs of family, the small mementos that soldiers carried to maintain their connection to the world they'd left behind.
The notification team was assembled to inform her next of kin, following protocols that had become tragically routine over 2 decades of continuous warfare. Her parents would receive the phone call that every military family dreaded, followed by the official visit that would transform her daughter into a living person, into a memory preserved in flag-draped ceremonies and posthumous commendations. But Elena Rodriguez was not dead. Battered, bloodied, and presumed killed in action, she had survived the tower's collapse through a combination of military training, pure luck, and the kind of stubborn refusal to die that had carried soldiers through impossible situations since warfare began. The explosion had thrown her clear of the main structure just before the concrete walls pancaked inward, leaving her unconscious but alive in a pile of debris that concealed her from both rescue teams and enemy fighters. When she regained consciousness 6 hours later, her situation was desperate but not hopeless. Separated from friendly forces, with no radio and limited ammunition, she faced the choice that defined combat survival: find a way back to safety or die trying. What she chose to do next would determine not only her own fate, but the lives of Marines that didn't even know she existed. The Taliban attack on the firebase had been more than opportunistic harassment. Intelligence reports that wouldn't be confirmed for weeks suggested it was a probing action, designed to test the coalition response and identify weaknesses that could be exploited in a larger offensive. Elena's apparent death had removed one of the most significant obstacles to enemy movement in the region, opening opportunities that insurgent commanders were already planning to exploit. 3 valleys to the east, Marine Forward Operating Base Granite was preparing for a routine supply run that would take a helicopter-borne landing team deep into disputed territory. The mission was considered low risk, a standard operation to deliver equipment and personnel to a remote observation post that monitored enemy activity along the Pakistan border. What the Marines didn't know, what their intelligence reports couldn't have predicted, was that Taliban fighters had been positioning themselves for weeks to ambush exactly this type of operation. The apparent success in eliminating the sniper at Firebase Copper had emboldened local commanders to attempt something more ambitious: the complete destruction of a Marine unit in a carefully orchestrated trap. The stage was set for a disaster that would cost dozens of lives and potentially shift the tactical balance in the entire region. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves in concealed positions around the designated landing zone, with heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices designed to destroy the helicopters and eliminate any survivors. But they made one critical miscalculation. Elena Rodriguez was not dead, and she was moving through the mountains toward a position that would give her a commanding view of the trap that awaited the unsuspecting Marines. What happened next would become the subject of investigation, analysis, and quiet respect among military professionals who understood that sometimes individual action could change the course of entire operations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sun was setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the rocky peaks in shades of amber and crimson that made the landscape look almost peaceful. In a few hours, darkness would provide cover for movements that could determine who lived and who died in the complex game of warfare that had consumed this region for over 2 decades. Somewhere in those mountains, a soldier who was supposed to be dead was preparing to demonstrate why reports of her demise had been greatly exaggerated. Elena Rodriguez had not always been a soldier. Growing up in the high desert of New Mexico, she had been Elena Vasquez, daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, more comfortable with textbooks than tactical manuals. The small town of Cedar Hill sat in a valley where the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape that taught patience and the value of seeing things from a distance. Her father, Miguel Vasquez, ran the only automotive repair shop for 50 miles in any direction. It was honest work that kept food on the table and a roof over their heads.
But it also meant long days under the hood of pickup trucks and farm equipment that seemed to determine to break down at the worst possible moments. Elena had spent countless afternoons in that garage, learning that complex problems usually had simple solutions if you understood how the pieces fit together. Her mother, Carmen, taught third grade at the local elementary school and believed education was the only reliable path out of poverty. She had filled their small house with books, magazines, and newspapers from bigger cities, determined that her daughter would see possibilities beyond the dusty streets of Cedar Hill. Carmen Rodriguez understood that knowledge was power, but she also understood that power without purpose was just potential energy waiting to be wasted. Elena had been a quiet child, more observer than participant in the social dynamics that define small-town life. While other kids played games that required noise and movement, she preferred activities that rewarded stillness and concentration. Jigsaw puzzles that took weeks to complete, chess matches against her father that stretched across entire evenings, reading books that transported her to places where different choices led to different outcomes. The shooting had started almost by accident. Cedar Hill High School offered exactly 3 extracurricular activities: football, cheerleading, and rifle team. Elena was too small for football, too reserved for cheerleading, and too curious about everything else to ignore the third option. The rifle team practiced in a basement range beneath the school gym, using .22 caliber rifles that had been donated by local hunters, who believed young people should learn to handle firearms safely. Coach Henderson was a Vietnam veteran who treated shooting as both art and science. He taught his students that shooting wasn't about being tough or aggressive. It was about understanding physics, controlling breathing, and maintaining the mental discipline to execute a plan under pressure. Elena absorbed these lessons like desert sand absorbed rare rainfall, discovering that she had both natural talent and the temperament to develop it systematically. Her first competition was a disaster. Nervous energy made her hand shake, and she finished near the bottom of a field that included shooters from schools with better equipment and more experienced coaches. But Coach Henderson had seen something in her approach to the sport, the way she studied other competitors and analyzed her own mistakes with clinical detachment. By her senior year, Elena was winning state championships and setting records that would stand for the next decade. College recruiters noticed, offering scholarships to universities with competitive shooting programs. But it was the ROTC scholarship that caught her attention, not because she had any particular desire to become a soldier, but because it offered the most comprehensive path to higher education. The University of Colorado at Boulder was a revelation. Students from all over the world pursuing degrees in subjects that didn't exist in Cedar Hill. Elena chose mechanical engineering, drawn to the same problem-solving mindset that had served her well in her father's garage and on the shooting range. The coursework was challenging but logical, each concept building on previous knowledge in ways that created increasingly sophisticated understanding. ROTC training added another dimension to her education: military science classes that examined warfare as both historical phenomenon and contemporary reality. Leadership exercises that forced her to make decisions under artificial pressure designed to simulate real-world stress. Physical training that pushed her body beyond limits she hadn't known existed. What surprised Elena most about military training was how much it resembled the discipline she'd learned through competitive shooting. The same attention to detail, the same requirement for consistent performance, the same understanding that small mistakes could have large consequences. The Army was teaching her to think systematically about problems that were larger and more complex than anything she had encountered, but the fundamental approach was familiar. Her mechanical engineering degree had practical applications that became apparent during advanced military training. Understanding stress loads and failure points helped her evaluate defensive positions. Knowledge of metallurgy and ballistics improved her shooting at longer ranges. The ability to read technical manuals and troubleshoot complex systems made her valuable in an army that increasingly relied on sophisticated technology. The transition from college student to active duty officer had been smoother than Elena expected. Her first assignment was with an engineering unit based in Georgia, where she spent 2 years learning how military organizations actually functioned. Not the idealized version presented in leadership classes, but the complex reality of managing people and resources under bureaucratic constraints that sometimes seemed designed to prevent mission accomplishment.
Her initial deployment to Iraq had been an education in the gap between training and reality. The enemy didn't follow the doctrinal patterns outlined in military manuals. Improvised explosive devices turned routine patrols into exercises in controlled paranoia. Cultural differences created friction that couldn't be resolved through superior firepower or organizational efficiency. But Elena adapted, as she had learned to adapt to every new challenge throughout her life. She discovered that her engineering background helped her understand how insurgent networks functioned, identifying weak points that could be exploited through targeted operations. Her shooting skills made her valuable for missions that required precision rather than volume of fire. More importantly, she learned to work with enlisted soldiers whose backgrounds and motivations were completely different from her own. Men and women who had joined the army for economic opportunity, family tradition, or simple desire for adventure. Elena realized that effective leadership meant understanding what drove people and finding ways to align individual motivations with mission requirements. Her promotion to staff sergeant had come after an incident that perfectly illustrated the complexity of modern warfare. Elena's unit had been providing security for a convoy carrying medical supplies to a rural clinic when they were ambushed by insurgents using a coordinated attack that included roadside bombs, small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades. The convoy commander had been killed in the initial explosion. The senior NCO was wounded and unable to maintain command and control. Elena found herself responsible for 17 soldiers in a tactical situation that was rapidly deteriorating. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves to prevent the convoy from moving forward or backward, creating a kill zone designed to destroy every vehicle and eliminate all survivors. Elena's response had been methodical and devastating. Using her engineering knowledge to identify the insurgents' most likely positions, she had directed accurate fire that disrupted their coordination and created opportunities for the convoy to maneuver. Her precision shooting eliminated key targets that allowed other soldiers to move without being cut down by enemy fire. But the incident that defined her reputation had occurred during the extraction phase. A wounded soldier was pinned down in an exposed position, unable to reach cover without being targeted by an enemy sniper who had remained hidden throughout the engagement. The Marine was bleeding and would die without immediate medical attention, but any rescue attempt would expose additional soldiers to accurate fire from a concealed position. Elena had spent 40 minutes locating the enemy sniper through patient observation and logical deduction. Wind patterns in the dust kicked up by previous shots, muzzle flash positions that created angles of fire consistent with the Marine's wounds, sound signatures that revealed the approximate range and direction of incoming fire. When she finally identified the target, the shot was technically demanding even by her standards. 830 meters through swirling dust and heat shimmer that distorted optical clarity. Crosswind that required compensation based on ballistic calculations she performed mentally while controlling her breathing and heart rate. The enemy sniper's rifle had gone silent with Elena's first shot. The rescue was completed without additional casualties, but the incident had established Elena's reputation as someone who could make impossible shots under impossible conditions. Word spread through military networks with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve. Unit commanders began requesting her for missions that required precision shooting under combat conditions. Her second deployment to Afghanistan had been different from Iraq in ways that reflected both her increased experience and the evolving nature of the conflict. The Taliban used different tactics than Iraqi insurgents, relying more heavily on ambushes in mountainous terrain that provided natural cover and concealment. The distances were longer, the environmental conditions more challenging, and the enemy more experienced in fighting coalition forces.
Elena had spent months learning to read Afghan terrain the way she had once read textbooks, understanding how elevation and weather affected ballistics, identifying natural positions that provided both concealment and fields of fire. Most importantly, developing the patience to wait for targets that might not appear for hours or days. The assignment to Firebase Copper had been routine, part of a rotation system designed to distribute experienced soldiers among forward operating bases that relied on individual expertise rather than large unit formations. Elena's role was straightforward: provide overwatch and precision fire support for base security and convoy escort missions. What had made the assignment challenging was the enemy's adaptation to her presence. Taliban fighters had learned to respect the reach of her rifle, changing their movement patterns and attack methods to account for the threat she represented. They had begun using indirect fire and standoff weapons to engage the firebase, reducing Elena's opportunities to identify and eliminate high-value targets. The watchtower had been both a sanctuary and a prison. From its elevated position, Elena could dominate the surrounding terrain in ways that kept coalition forces alive. But the same height and visibility that made her effective also made her a priority target for enemy forces who understood that eliminating her would significantly improve their tactical options. She had spent 6 months in that tower, maintaining a routine that balanced vigilance with the physical and mental stamina required for long-term operations. Pre-dawn positioning to catch enemy movement during the transition from darkness to daylight. Systematic observation of terrain features that might conceal hostile activity. Equipment maintenance that ensured her rifle would function perfectly when precision mattered most.
The tower had become more than just a fighting position. It was a space where Elena could exercise skills that had been developing since her childhood in New Mexico, the same patience she had learned assembling jigsaw puzzles, the same analytical thinking she had applied to mechanical engineering problems, the same precise execution she had perfected through years of competitive shooting. But the tower was gone now, collapsed into rubble that had buried her old life along with her equipment and personal belongings. Elena Rodriguez, the engineer, the competitive shooter, the small-town girl with big dreams, all of those identities had been crushed under tons of concrete and officially declared dead by military bureaucracy that required definitive answers to complex questions. What emerged from the wreckage was something different, something shaped by survival instincts that civilian life had never activated. Elena Rodriguez had died in the collapse of the watchtower. What walked away from the debris field was a predator, injured and alone, but possessing skills that could determine the outcome of battles yet to be fought. The mountains of Kunar province had been killing soldiers for centuries before Americans arrived with their advanced weapons and sophisticated communications equipment. Alexander the Great had lost men in these same valleys. British forces during the Victorian era had learned to respect terrain that turned every ridge into a potential ambush site. Soviet troops had discovered that superior firepower meant little when the enemy could appear and disappear like smoke among the rocky peaks. Elena Rodriguez understood this history not from textbooks, but from 6 months of daily observation through a rifle scope that revealed the tactical reality of fighting in terrain that favored defenders over attackers. Every ridge concealed potential firing positions. Every valley offered multiple escape routes for enemy forces who knew the ground better than any outsider ever could. The mountains themselves were weapons in the hands of fighters who had grown up among these peaks. The Taliban forces operating in Elena's area of responsibility were not the disorganized insurgents that American media often portrayed. These were experienced fighters, many of whom had been conducting guerrilla operations for over 2 decades. They understood coalition tactics, having observed and adapted to American methods through years of continuous combat.
More importantly, they possessed the local knowledge and community support that made them nearly impossible to eliminate permanently. Their leader was a man known simply as Hakim, though intelligence reports suggested this was likely an operational alias rather than his real name. Mid-40s, scarred by shrapnel from a drone strike that had killed his younger brother, he commanded a network of fighters who moved through the mountains like ghosts. Hakim had learned to think like his American opponents, studying their patterns and procedures with the same analytical approach that Elena applied to long-range shooting. What made Hakim particularly dangerous was his understanding of psychological warfare. He knew that killing one American sniper would have tactical effects far beyond the loss of a single soldier. It would demoralize coalition forces, reduce the effectiveness of their overwatch capabilities, and demonstrate that even the most skilled operators were vulnerable to properly planned attacks. The decision to target Elena's watchtower had been months in the making. Hakim's fighters had spent weeks identifying the tower's construction weaknesses, studying the blast patterns that would cause maximum structural damage, and positioning the rocket-propelled grenade launcher in a location that provided both clear line of sight and multiple escape routes. But the attack on the tower was only the beginning of a larger plan that aimed to shift the tactical balance throughout the region. Intelligence networks that took years to develop had identified a pattern in Marine operations that created a vulnerability Hakim intended to exploit. Helicopter-borne supply missions followed predictable routes and timing, landing at coordinates that could be determined through careful observation of flight patterns. The supply run to Forward Operating Base Granite represented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that American forces were not invincible, that superior technology and training could be overcome by fighters who combined local knowledge with careful planning and absolute commitment to their cause. Captain Derek Morrison commanded the Marine unit tasked with the Granite supply mission. 29 years old, 3 combat deployments, decorated for valor during a firefight in Helmand Province that had saved the lives of 12 wounded Marines. Morrison represented everything the Corps valued: aggressive leadership, tactical competence, and the kind of personal courage that inspired subordinates to follow orders even when those orders led directly into danger. But Morrison's greatest strength was also his most significant weakness. His success in previous operations had created confidence that bordered on complacency. He had survived situations that killed other Marines through a combination of skill, determination, and luck that he had begun to interpret as tactical superiority. The possibility that enemy forces might be more competent than his intelligence reports suggested was not a scenario he had seriously considered. The Marines under Morrison's command reflected the diversity that characterized modern American military units. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, a farm kid from Iowa whose calm demeanor concealed the kind of ruthless efficiency that made him effective in close-quarters combat. Corporal Maria Santos, a mechanic's daughter from Los Angeles who had joined the Corps to escape neighborhood gang violence and discovered she had both aptitude and appetite for military life.
Lance Corporal Tyler Brooks represented the newest generation of Marines, raised on video games that portrayed warfare as a series of manageable challenges with clear victory conditions. Intelligent and physically capable, but lacking the experience that taught veterans to question optimistic assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions. Private First Class Kevin Chen had been in country for exactly 37 days, still adjusting to environmental conditions that bore no resemblance to training exercises conducted at Camp Pendleton. Chen possessed technical skills that made him valuable for communications and electronic warfare, but he had not yet developed the tactical instincts that kept Marines alive during the chaos of actual combat. The mission planning for the Granite supply run had followed standard procedures that balanced operational security with practical requirements. Flight routes were varied to prevent enemy forces from predicting exact timing and locations. Landing zones were selected to provide defensive advantages and multiple extraction options. Intelligence reports were analyzed to identify potential threats and develop contingency plans. What the intelligence reports could not reveal was the extent of Hakeem's network or the sophistication of his planning. American signals intelligence could intercept radio communications and track known enemy fighters, but it could not penetrate a command structure that relied on personal relationships and face-to-face meetings in locations that had been chosen specifically to avoid electronic surveillance. 3 weeks before the scheduled supply mission, Hakeem's fighters had begun positioning themselves in the mountains surrounding the designated landing zone. Not all at once, which might have attracted attention from coalition surveillance assets, but gradually, using routes and hiding places that had been developed through years of experience, moving through terrain that coalition forces could observe but never fully control. The fighters came from different backgrounds, but shared common motivations that made them willing to risk death for the chance to kill Americans. Ahmed had lost his father to a coalition airstrike that had been intended to target a Taliban commander, but had killed civilians instead. Rashid's village had been destroyed during a counterinsurgency operation that had displaced hundreds of families without producing significant intelligence about enemy activities. Mahmoud was motivated by religious conviction, reinforced by years of listening to Taliban propaganda that portrayed the conflict as a holy war between Islam and Christianity. Omar fought for reasons that were more personal and immediate. Coalition forces had disrupted smuggling operations that provided income for his extended family, creating economic hardship that could only be resolved through armed resistance. What unified these fighters was their understanding that individual sacrifice could achieve strategic effects far beyond their personal contributions. Each man knew he might die during the planned ambush, but each also understood that successfully destroying an American helicopter and killing its crew would demonstrate Taliban capabilities to potential recruits throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. The weapons they carried reflected the evolution of insurgent tactics over 2 decades of continuous warfare. AK-47 assault rifles that were reliable in desert conditions and easy to maintain without sophisticated logistics support. Rocket-propelled grenades that could destroy armored vehicles and aircraft with single shots placed accurately. Heavy machine guns captured from Afghan army units that had been overrun during previous Taliban operations. But their most effective weapon was knowledge of terrain that had been passed down through generations of fighters who had learned to use the mountains themselves as tactical advantages. Positions that provided concealment from American surveillance aircraft, routes that allowed rapid movement between fighting positions without exposure to coalition fire, escape routes that led to safe areas where fighters could regroup and plan future operations. The positioning phase of Hakeem's plan required 12 days of careful movement that avoided coalition patrols and surveillance assets. Fighters moved individually or in pairs, using goat trails and dry riverbeds that provided concealment from thermal imaging systems. Food and ammunition were cached in positions that had been selected months earlier, reducing the logistical signature that might alert American intelligence analysts to increased enemy activity. Each fighter was assigned specific responsibilities within the overall ambush plan. Machine gun teams would target the helicopters during the landing approach, attempting to destroy aircraft before Marines could disembark and establish defensive positions. RPG teams would focus on any helicopters that managed to land, creating secondary explosions that would eliminate both aircraft and personnel.
Rifle squads would engage Marines who survived the initial attack, using predetermined fields of fire to create overlapping zones that prevented coalition forces from maneuvering to more defensible positions.
The plan anticipated that some Marines would survive the helicopter destruction and attempt to establish perimeter defense, but Hakim's positioning ensured that such defensive positions would be subject to accurate fire from multiple directions. The timeline for the ambush was based on intelligence about American helicopter operations that had been gathered through months of observation. Marine supply missions typically launched during morning hours to avoid afternoon thermal conditions that made flying more dangerous in mountainous terrain. Flight times from major bases could be calculated based on aircraft performance and distance to target areas. Most importantly, Hakim understood that Marine rescue procedures required predictable responses that created additional targeting opportunities. When helicopters were destroyed, rescue missions would be launched within hours, using flight routes and landing zones that could be anticipated by fighters who understood American tactical doctrine. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. A single coordinated attack could destroy multiple aircraft, eliminate dozens of Marines, and demonstrate Taliban capabilities to audiences throughout the region. Success would encourage recruitment, increase financial support from external sponsors, and potentially influence American domestic opinion about the costs of continued military involvement in Afghanistan. But Hakim's plan contained one critical assumption that would determine whether the ambush succeeded or failed catastrophically. The plan assumed that Elena Rodriguez was dead, that the sniper who had dominated these mountains for 6 months was buried under tons of concrete and no longer capable of influencing tactical situations. This assumption was about to be tested in ways that would determine the fate of every Marine aboard the helicopters heading toward what they believed was a routine supply mission. Unknown to both sides in the developing confrontation, Elena Rodriguez was alive, injured but functional, and moving through the mountains toward a position that would provide her with commanding views of the planned battlefield. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the decisive importance of individual skill and determination in warfare, that often seemed dominated by technology and organizational advantages. In less than 24 hours, Marines who had never heard Elena Rodriguez's name would owe their lives to shooting skills that had been developed in a high school basement in New Mexico and refined through years of combat in some of the world's most dangerous places. The mountains waited, indifferent to human plans and preparations, ready to witness another chapter in the endless cycle of violence that had defined this region for centuries. But this time, the outcome would be determined by a soldier who was supposed to be dead, but had instead become something far more dangerous than anyone on either side of the conflict could have imagined. Elena Rodriguez opened her eyes to a world transformed by pain and disorientation. The darkness was absolute, broken only by thin shafts of light that filtered through gaps in the concrete debris that had become her tomb. Her body catalog of injuries revealed itself with methodical precision: probable concussion from the blast wave, deep lacerations on her left arm where twisted rebar had torn through fabric and flesh, bruised ribs that made breathing a conscious effort requiring careful control. But she was alive, and in her current situation, that biological fact represented the difference between mission failure and the possibility of continued tactical relevance. Elena's training had taught her to compartmentalize physical discomfort, to treat pain as information rather than limitation. The injuries were significant, but not immediately life-threatening. More importantly, they had not compromised her ability to think clearly or manipulate weapons with the precision that defined her military value. Her space that contained her was roughly triangular, formed by concrete slabs that had fallen at angles that created a pocket of survivable air. Perhaps 8 feet long, 4 feet wide at its broadest point, with a ceiling height that varied from 18 inches to just over 3 feet. Not comfortable by any definition, but sufficient to allow basic movement and assessment of her tactical situation. Her rifle was gone, crushed somewhere in the tons of debris that filled what had been the tower's interior. The sidearm holstered at her hip had survived, though the magazine had been damaged by falling concrete and would need to be replaced. Her load-bearing desk contained 4 additional magazines, a medical kit, emergency rations for 72 hours, and communications equipment that had been destroyed when the tower collapsed.
The absence of radio communications meant Elena could not contact Firebase Copper to report her survival or receive updates on the tactical situation. For all practical purposes, she was operating independently, without support or coordination with friendly forces. This isolation was tactically disadvantageous but also liberating in ways that conventional military doctrine rarely acknowledged. Elena began the careful process of extracting herself from the debris field, moving slowly to avoid shifting concrete slabs that might collapse further and eliminate the air pocket that had kept her alive. Each movement required calculation, understanding how disturbing one piece of rubble might affect the stability of everything above and around her current position. The work was exhausting, physically demanding in ways that pushed her injured body to limits that might have been dangerous under different circumstances. But Elena had learned through years of military service that the difference between possible and impossible was often simply a matter of refusing to accept limitations that existed primarily in the mind rather than the body. 3 hours after regaining consciousness, she emerged from the debris field into pre-dawn darkness that felt like freedom despite the tactical challenges it represented. The landscape around the collapsed tower had been transformed by the explosion, scattered with chunks of concrete and twisted metal that would make movement difficult and potentially dangerous in low-light conditions. Elena's first priority was medical attention for injuries that could compromise her effectiveness if left untreated. The lacerations on her left arm required cleaning and bandaging to prevent infection that could become life-threatening in an environment where medical care was not readily available. The head injury needed monitoring for symptoms that might indicate traumatic brain damage requiring immediate evacuation. But medical treatment was a luxury that her tactical situation might not permit. Elena could hear small arms fire from the direction of Firebase Copper, indicating that enemy forces were maintaining pressure on coalition positions. The attack that had destroyed her tower was part of a larger operation, and her survival meant nothing if she could not contribute to the defense of friendly forces or the completion of missions that were already in progress. The assessment of her immediate tactical options revealed choices that were limited but not hopeless. She could attempt to return to Firebase Copper, but the route would require crossing terrain that was likely under enemy observation and potentially controlled by Taliban fighters who believed she was dead. Discovery would mean capture or death, neither of which would contribute to coalition mission success. Alternatively, she could move deeper into the mountains, seeking positions that would allow her to observe enemy activities and potentially disrupt their operations through harassment attacks. This option offered better survival prospects, but would have minimal tactical impact on the larger conflict that was developing throughout the region. The third option was the most dangerous but potentially most significant. Elena could attempt to intercept the Taliban fighters who were positioning themselves for future operations, using her knowledge of local terrain and enemy tactics to disrupt plans that might cost American lives. This choice would require operating alone in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no communication support. Elena's decision was influenced by intelligence information she had gathered through months of observation from the watchtower. Taliban movement patterns suggested major operations were being planned, coordinated attacks that would require multiple fighter groups to position themselves in predetermined locations over extended time periods. Disrupting these positioning movements could prevent attacks that might otherwise succeed. As dawn approached, Elena began moving north toward terrain that provided both concealment and observation of routes that enemy forces used to move between their camps and operational areas. Her movement was deliberate and methodical, using natural cover and avoiding ridgelines or open areas where she might be silhouetted against the sky. The mountains in this region were characterized by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent concealment, but also created tactical challenges for anyone attempting to move quietly. Loose stone could shift underfoot, creating noise that would alert enemy forces to American presence in areas where no coalition patrols were expected. Elena's progress was measured in hundreds of meters per hour, rather than the kilometers that normal tactical movement might achieve. But speed was less important than stealth in her current situation. Elena's advantage lay in being presumed dead,
allowing her to operate in areas where enemy forces might not maintain the security procedures they would normally employ against known American positions. She was, in effect, a ghost haunting mountains that Taliban fighters believed they controlled.
By mid-morning, Elena had reached an observation position that provided commanding views of 3 valleys that intersected near a village that intelligence reports identified as a Taliban logistics hub. From this vantage point, she could monitor enemy movements while remaining concealed from ground observation and most aerial surveillance platforms that might mistake her for hostile forces. The view through her rifle's damaged scope revealed activity that confirmed her assessment of enemy intentions. Taliban fighters were moving in small groups along routes that avoided known coalition observation posts, carrying equipment that suggested preparations for sustained combat operations, rather than the hit-and-run attacks that characterized most insurgent activities in the region. Elena counted at least 30 fighters moving through the valleys below her position, armed with heavy weapons that included rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and what appeared to be improvised explosive devices designed for use against helicopters or ground vehicles. The coordination of their movements suggested central planning and communications that indicated a higher level of organizational sophistication than coalition intelligence had previously identified. More concerning was the discovery that enemy forces were establishing positions around a landing zone that Elena recognized from previous mission briefings. The coordinates matched locations used for supply drops to Forward Operating Base Granite, a Marine position that relied on helicopter resupply for ammunition, medical supplies, and personnel rotation. The tactical picture that emerged from Elena's observations was clear and alarming. Taliban forces were preparing a coordinated ambush designed to destroy Marine helicopters and eliminate their crews and passengers. The attack would likely occur during the next scheduled supply mission, which Elena's knowledge of coalition procedures suggested would happen within the next 24 to 48 hours. Elena's isolation meant she could not warn friendly forces about the developing threat through normal communications channels. Her radio was destroyed, and attempting to reach Firebase Copper would require crossing terrain that was now under enemy control. Even if she could establish communications, her reported death meant that intelligence reports from her position would be viewed with skepticism that might delay tactical responses. But Elena possessed advantages that enemy forces could not anticipate. Her detailed knowledge of Taliban operating procedures, gained through months of observation, allowed her to predict their likely actions and positioning. Her marksmanship skills, while limited by ammunition constraints, could potentially disrupt enemy plans if applied at critical moments during their preparation phase. Most importantly, Elena understood that her presumed death created psychological advantages that could be exploited against enemy forces who believed they had eliminated the primary threat to their operations. Taliban fighters who had learned to respect her reach and accuracy would be operating under the assumption that those capabilities no longer existed, potentially making them less cautious about exposure and movement during daylight hours. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the mountainous terrain, Elena observed increased enemy activity that suggested the ambush was entering its final preparation phase. Taliban fighters were occupying positions that provided overlapping fields of fire into the landing zone, while maintaining concealment from helicopter crews who would be focused on navigation and landing procedures rather than ground reconnaissance. The enemy plan was tactically sound and operationally devastating in its potential effectiveness. Marine helicopters approaching the landing zone would be vulnerable during the final approach phase, when aircraft were moving slowly and pilots were concentrated on avoiding obstacles rather than identifying threats. The Taliban positions provided multiple angles of attack that would make evasive maneuvering nearly impossible. Elena's analysis of the tactical situation revealed that enemy success depended on maintaining positional advantages that could be disrupted by accurate fire from unexpected directions. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to engage targets in the landing zone, but their defensive preparations assumed threats would come from coalition aircraft rather than ground-based snipers operating from positions they believed were unoccupied. As evening approached, Elena began moving toward a ridgeline that would provide her with commanding views of the planned ambush site while remaining concealed from enemy observation posts. The position would require her to cross approximately 2 kilometers of terrain that offered minimal cover, but it would place her within effective range of Taliban fighting positions with fields of fire that could potentially disrupt their coordinated attack. The movement to her selected position would require most of the night, moving slowly to avoid detection while navigating terrain that was both physically challenging and tactically dangerous. Elena's injured condition would make the journey more difficult, but her survival thus far had demonstrated that determination could overcome physical limitations when the stakes were sufficiently high. As evening approached, Elena began moving toward a ridgeline that would provide her with commanding views of the planned ambush site, while remaining concealed from enemy observation posts. The position would require her to cross approximately 2 kilometers of terrain that offered minimal cover, but it would place her within effective range of Taliban fighting positions with fields of fire that could potentially disrupt their coordinated attack. The movement to her selected position would require most of the night, moving slowly to avoid detection while navigating terrain that was both physically challenging and tactically dangerous. Elena's injured condition would make the journey more difficult, but her survival thus far had demonstrated that determination could overcome physical limitations when the stakes were sufficiently high. As darkness fell over the mountains of Afghanistan, Elena Rodriguez began what might be her final mission, carrying skills and knowledge that could determine the fate of Marines she had never met, but whose lives now depended on shooting abilities that had been presumed buried under tons of concrete. The ghost in the mountains was moving toward a confrontation that would test every lesson she had learned during a lifetime of preparing for moments when individual action could change the outcome of battles. The ridge Elena had selected for her final position rose like a stone monument against the pre-dawn sky, its jagged silhouette marking terrain that had witnessed countless battles throughout Afghanistan's violent history. The climb had taken 7 hours of careful movement through darkness that concealed both her approach and the physical toll that each step extracted from her injured body. Blood from her arm wound had soaked through the field dressing, and the concussion symptoms created moments of disorientation that required conscious effort to overcome. But as the first pale light of dawn began illuminating the mountains, Elena Rodriguez occupied a position that provided commanding views of the valley where Taliban fighters were preparing to destroy a Marine helicopter and kill everyone aboard. Her elevation advantage was nearly 800 meters above the planned landing zone, with clear lines of sight to enemy positions that had been carefully concealed from aerial observation but were exposed to someone shooting from the high ground. Through the damaged optics of a rifle she had recovered from a Taliban fighter killed during her movement to the ridge, Elena could observe the final preparations for an ambush that represented months of planning and coordination. Enemy fighters were conducting weapons checks, adjusting positions to optimize fields of fire, and coordinating timing that would ensure their attack achieved maximum surprise and lethality. The rifle in her hands was not the precision instrument she had used for 6 months of operations from the watchtower. The AK-47 variant was designed for reliability rather than accuracy, with iron sights that were adequate for ranges under 300 meters, but inadequate for the precision shooting that her current tactical situation would require. The scope she had salvaged from her destroyed Barrett rifle could be mounted on the enemy weapon, but the improvised combination would never achieve the accuracy she had grown accustomed to using.
Elena's ammunition situation was equally challenging. The magazines recovered from enemy fighters contained standard 7.62 by 39 mm rounds, designed for volume of fire rather than precision engagement. She had managed to collect 63 rounds during her movement through the mountains, enough for sustained firefight, but insufficient for the kind of precise, economical shooting that had defined her reputation as a sniper. More critically, Elena's physical condition was deteriorating in ways that would affect her shooting performance.
The head injury created intermittent vision problems that made target identification more difficult. Her left arm, weakened by blood loss and nerve damage, could not provide the steady support that accurate long-range shooting required. Even her breathing, compromised by injured ribs, affected her ability to control the natural body movements that could throw off a precision shot. But Elena Rodriguez had not survived the collapse of a watchtower, crossed hostile terrain while injured, and climbed to an impossible firing position in order to fail when Marines needed her most. She understood that her current situation required adaptation rather than ideal conditions, improvisation rather than perfect equipment, and determination rather than optimal physical capability. The first Marine helicopter appeared on the horizon at 0734 hours, exactly on schedule according to operational patterns Elena had observed during months of watching coalition air movements. The CH-53E Super Stallion was massive and unmistakable, its distinctive rotor signature audible from miles away as it approached terrain that its crew believed was secure, but which Elena knew was surrounded by enemy forces waiting in carefully prepared positions. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the aircraft's internal communication system as he conducted the final briefing for his Marines. The landing zone had been used multiple times without incident. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, and the mission was expected to be completed within 45 minutes from touchdown to extraction. What Morrison could not know, what no one in the helicopter could anticipate, was that Taliban fighters had been positioning themselves for weeks around the landing zone, using concealment techniques that made them invisible to aerial reconnaissance, while providing multiple angles of attack that would turn the supply drop into a coordinated ambush with devastating effectiveness. Elena tracked the helicopter's approach through her improvised scope, calculating range and wind conditions while monitoring enemy positions that showed no sign of detection or concern about coalition aircraft. The Taliban fighters remained concealed, disciplined enough to wait for the optimal moment to begin their attack when the helicopter was most vulnerable, and the Marines were committed to landing procedures that would prevent immediate evasive maneuvers. The helicopter began its final approach, descending toward coordinates that placed it directly in the center of interlocking fields of fire that Taliban fighters had spent months perfecting. Elena could see muzzle flashes beginning to appear as enemy forces prepared to engage, weapons trained on a landing zone that would become a kill zone within seconds of the aircraft touching down. Elena's first shot was not aimed at enemy fighters, but at a cache of rocket-propelled grenades that Taliban forces had positioned to destroy the helicopter during its landing sequence. The improvised explosive device was located 400 meters below her position, concealed among rocks that provided both camouflage and protection from aerial observation. Her bullet struck the primary charge with enough force to trigger a secondary explosion that eliminated the weapons cache and announced to everyone in the valley that an unexpected participant had joined the engagement.
The explosion created chaos among Taliban positions that had been coordinated around precise timing and mutual support. Fighters who had been focused on the approaching helicopter suddenly found themselves under attack from an impossible direction, taking accurate fire from a position that intelligence reports indicated was unoccupied and tactically irrelevant to their operational plans. Elena's second shot eliminated a machine gun team that had been positioned to rake the landing zone with sustained automatic fire. The range was over 600 meters, challenging for any rifle, but particularly difficult given her improvised equipment and physical condition. But years of training and combat experience allowed her to compensate for equipment limitations through technique and determination that transformed adequate weapons into precision instruments. The machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris that marked another direct hit on enemy forces who had believed themselves safe from coalition ground fire.
Taliban fighters began shifting positions, attempting to identify the source of attacks that were disrupting carefully rehearsed plans and eliminating key weapon systems that were essential for ambush success. Elena's systematic destruction of enemy positions continued with methodical precision that demonstrated why she had earned respect from both American commanders and Taliban fighters throughout the region. Each shot was calculated not just for immediate effect, but for maximum disruption of enemy coordination and morale. She targeted communications equipment, heavy weapons, and leadership positions that were essential for maintaining the disciplined fire control that coordinated ambushes required. The Taliban's response was immediate but ineffective. Fighters who had spent months learning to avoid the reach of the American sniper in the watchtower suddenly found themselves under attack from a position they had not anticipated and could not immediately locate. Their return fire was scattered and uncoordinated, revealing their positions without achieving significant effects against Elena's concealed location on the high ground. But Elena's intervention was achieving effects beyond the immediate tactical situation. The helicopter crew, observing explosions and small arms fire around the landing zone, recognized that the area was contested and began evasive maneuvering that would prevent them from landing in the middle of an active firefight. Captain Morrison's voice was calm but urgent as he ordered his Marines to prepare for combat operations rather than routine supply procedures. The transformation of the tactical situation was complete and decisive. What had begun as a carefully planned ambush designed to destroy American aircraft and eliminate Marine personnel had become a firefight that favored coalition forces who possessed superior firepower, communications, and tactical flexibility. Elena's accurate fire had disrupted enemy coordination while alerting friendly forces to threats they had not previously detected. Taliban fighters began withdrawing from positions that had become untenable under accurate fire from multiple directions. The helicopter crew coordinated with ground forces to identify remaining enemy positions, while Elena continued engaging targets of opportunity that presented themselves during the enemy retreat. But Elena's most challenging shot was yet to come. Hakim, the Taliban commander who had planned the ambush with such meticulous attention to detail, had positioned himself in a bunker that provided both protection and communications capability for coordinating the attack. The position was over 900 meters from Elena's location, partially concealed behind rock formations that made target identification extremely difficult, even with optimal equipment and conditions. Elena's damaged scope barely adequate magnification for such an extreme range engagement. Her improvised rifle lacked the accuracy required for precision shooting at distances that challenged the capabilities of purpose-built sniper systems. Her physical condition, deteriorating throughout hours of sustained combat, made steady aim increasingly difficult to maintain. But through her scope, Elena could see Hakim coordinating a withdrawal that would preserve most of his forces for future operations against coalition positions throughout the region. His survival would mean continued attacks against American personnel, ongoing threats to supply operations, and the tactical intelligence he had gained during the failed ambush applied to future operations that might succeed where this one had failed.
Elena's final shot required every lesson she had learned during a lifetime of precision shooting. Compensation for wind that varied across the nearly kilometer range to target, calculation of bullet drop that exceeded the capabilities of her improvised scope's ranging system, adjustment for her own physical limitations, and the mechanical inadequacies of equipment that had never been designed for such demanding applications. The shot was perfect. Hakim's command position erupted in smoke and dust that marked the elimination of enemy leadership and the final collapse of Taliban coordination in the valley. Remaining enemy fighters abandoned their positions and weapons, fleeing toward mountain passages that would carry them away from American firepower and the ghost sniper who had appeared from nowhere to destroy their carefully planned operation.
The helicopter landed in a zone that had been cleared of enemy forces through individual action that military doctrine suggested was impossible. Marines disembarked into a tactical situation that had been transformed by shooting skills that most people believed existed only in movies and novels. Captain Morrison's after-action report would struggle to explain how a single shooter had eliminated an entire enemy network that had been positioned to destroy his aircraft and kill his Marines. Intelligence analysts would spend weeks attempting to identify the coalition asset responsible for tactical effects that had prevented what could have been one of the war's most devastating ambushes. But Elena Rodriguez was already moving away from her position, disappearing into mountains that had hidden fighters and fugitives for centuries. Her mission was complete, her ammunition exhausted, and her survival dependent on reaching friendly positions before Taliban reinforcements could organize search operations to locate the sniper who had shattered their plans. The ghost in the mountains had saved lives that would never know her name, using skills that had been presumed buried under tons of concrete but had instead emerged transformed by survival into something more dangerous and decisive than anyone had imagined possible. The silence that followed Elena's final shot was profound and unsettling, broken only by the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors and the distant echoes of Taliban fighters retreating through mountain passes they had used for decades to escape superior firepower. Captain Morrison stood in the center of what should have been a kill zone, surrounded by evidence of a coordinated ambush that had been systematically destroyed by someone who was not supposed to exist. Scattered around the landing zone were the remains of weapons positions that intelligence reports had failed to detect. Destroyed machine gun nests revealed fields of fire that would have turned the helicopter into scrap metal within seconds of landing. Cratered mortar positions showed where indirect fire would have prevented any possibility of extraction or reinforcement. Most disturbing were the carefully concealed bunkers that had been eliminated with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of Taliban tactics and positioning. The Marine reconnaissance team that secured the perimeter found evidence of planning that extended far beyond opportunistic harassment attacks. Communication equipment indicated coordination between multiple fighter groups. Ammunition caches suggested preparations for sustained combat operations. Maps and documents recovered from abandoned positions revealed intelligence about coalition movement patterns that should have been classified beyond enemy access. But the most puzzling discovery was the ballistic evidence that pointed toward shooting from positions that aerial reconnaissance had confirmed were unoccupied. The angles of impact on destroyed Taliban positions indicated fire from elevations that coalition forces had not utilized during the engagement. Shell casings found at various locations were from weapons that did not match any equipment carried by the helicopter crew or the Marines they had transported.
The mystery deepened when communications intercepts revealed Taliban radio traffic discussing attacks by the Ghost Who Cannot Die. Enemy fighters were reporting engagement by the American sniper who had been killed when the watchtower collapsed, describing accurate fire from positions that suggested supernatural rather than tactical capabilities. The psychological effect on remaining Taliban forces was immediate and significant, with multiple units withdrawing from planned operations throughout the region. Colonel Sarah Mitchell commanded intelligence operations for coalition forces in eastern Afghanistan, and the reports from the Granite Supply mission presented analytical challenges that conventional threat assessment procedures could not address. The tactical effects were undeniable. A coordinated enemy ambush had been disrupted with precision that prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of American personnel and equipment. But the source of these tactical effects remained unknown despite comprehensive analysis by intelligence specialists who possessed access to real-time surveillance data from multiple platforms. Drone footage showed no coalition ground forces in the area where the effective fire had originated. Communications intercepts revealed no coordination between known American units and the unknown shooter who had eliminated enemy positions with such devastating accuracy.
The possibility that Elena Rodriguez had survived the watchtower collapse was considered and initially dismissed based on physical evidence that seemed to confirm her death. The violence of the explosion, the massive structural collapse, and the absence of any radio communications after the attack all suggested that survival was impossible. Recovery operations had found her damaged equipment and blood-stained clothing but no body, leading to the assumption that her remains were buried under debris that would require heavy machinery to remove. But Colonel Mitchell's analytical training had taught her to question assumptions that seemed obvious, particularly when tactical results contradicted intelligence assessments. The effectiveness of the unknown shooter, the precision of target selection, and the intimate knowledge of Taliban tactics displayed during the engagement all suggested capabilities that matched Elena Rodriguez's documented skills and experience. The investigation that followed required coordination between multiple agencies and analysis of classified information that painted a more complete picture of Elena's background and capabilities. Her personnel file revealed training and deployments that had been sanitized for operational security reasons, removing details about specialized programs and assignments that were not disclosed through normal military channels. What emerged from this deeper analysis was the profile of a soldier whose skills and experience exceeded what conventional records indicated. Elena Rodriguez had participated in classified operations that required capabilities far beyond standard infantry or even specialized sniper training. Her psychological evaluations indicated unusual resilience and adaptability under extreme stress conditions. Most significantly, her performance metrics suggested effectiveness levels that placed her among the most capable operators in American Special Operations Forces.
The search team that Kane assembled included specialists in combat medicine, mountain warfare, and personnel recovery operations in hostile territory. Each member understood that they might be looking for someone whose survival skills and tactical knowledge made her more dangerous than most enemy forces they had encountered during multiple combat deployments. The debris field around the collapsed watchtower revealed evidence that supported the possibility of survival despite the apparent impossibility of anyone escaping such massive structural destruction. Blood traces led away from the wreckage in patterns consistent with an injured person moving deliberately toward concealment rather than wandering randomly in shock or confusion. More significantly, the search team discovered equipment caches and fighting positions that showed evidence of recent use by someone with intimate knowledge of American military procedures and Taliban tactical methods. Water sources had been utilized, ammunition had been redistributed, and observation posts had been established in locations that provided optimal surveillance of enemy movement routes. The trail that Elena had left during her movement through the mountains told a story that impressed even experienced special operations personnel who understood the challenges of survival in hostile territory while injured and operating without support. Her route selection showed tactical intelligence that maximized concealment while maintaining observation of enemy activities. Her resource management demonstrated skills that extended survival capabilities far beyond what standard military training provided. But the most compelling evidence of Elena's survival and actions was discovered at the ridge position where she had conducted her engagement of Taliban forces during the helicopter ambush. Shell casings from the improvised rifle she had used were found alongside evidence of the careful preparation and precise shooting that had eliminated enemy positions with devastating effectiveness. The ballistic analysis confirmed what tactical experts had suspected. The unknown shooter who had saved Captain Morrison's Marines possessed capabilities that matched Elena Rodriguez's documented skills, training, and experience. The precision of the engagement, the tactical intelligence demonstrated in target selection, and the improvised adaptation of inferior equipment to achieve superior results all pointed toward a soldier whose abilities exceeded conventional performance parameters. Master Chief Kane's report to Colonel Mitchell was necessarily classified at levels that restricted distribution to personnel who possessed both security clearances and operational need to know Elena Rodriguez's actual status.
The implications of her survival extended beyond individual circumstances to questions about intelligence procedures, casualty reporting accuracy, and the psychological effects on enemy forces who believed they had eliminated a significant coalition asset. But the most immediate concern was Elena's current location and condition. The evidence suggested she had survived the engagement with Taliban forces and was attempting to return to friendly positions through terrain that remained contested and dangerous. Her injuries, combined with exposure and limited resources, created survival challenges that could prove fatal despite her demonstrated capabilities and determination.
The rescue operation that was organized to locate Elena Rodriguez required careful coordination between multiple military units and intelligence agencies. Search patterns had to account for her likely movement routes while avoiding interference with ongoing combat operations. Communications procedures needed to identify Elena without revealing information that could compromise operational security if intercepted by enemy forces. Most challenging was the requirement to locate someone whose survival skills and tactical knowledge made her nearly invisible to conventional search procedures. Elena Rodriguez had spent months learning to move through Afghan terrain without detection, and her current circumstances would activate every survival instinct and concealment technique she had developed through years of specialized training and combat experience. The broader implications of Elena's survival were already being analyzed by intelligence specialists, who understood that her actions during the helicopter ambush had effects extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Taliban forces throughout the region were reporting encounters with the Ghost sniper, whose supposed death had emboldened their operational planning. Enemy morale was being affected by reports that the American sniper, who had dominated these mountains for months, was not dead but had instead become more dangerous and unpredictable. Operations that had been planned around the assumption that Elena Rodriguez's capabilities were no longer available were being postponed or canceled as Taliban commanders reassessed the tactical environment. From a strategic perspective, Elena's survival represented both opportunity and challenge for coalition forces. Her demonstrated effectiveness against enemy positions could be leveraged to maintain pressure on Taliban operations throughout the region. But her presumed death status created administrative and security complications that would need to be resolved through channels that preserved both her safety and operational effectiveness. The search for Elena Rodriguez continued through terrain that had been contested by various military forces for centuries, each group learning that survival in these mountains required adaptation, determination, and skills that could not be taught through conventional training programs. Somewhere in those peaks and valleys, a soldier who was supposed to be dead was making her way towards safety, carrying knowledge and experience that could continue to influence the outcome of battles yet to be fought. The ghost in the mountains was real, and the implications of her existence would reshape tactical planning and enemy assessment throughout the region for months to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.